Hey, welcome to the Longmont Pastor blog. I'm joined today by Benjamin Morrison. Hey, Ben, thanks for joining us.
Hey Nick, good to be with you.
Today, we're going to be talking about a question that had been submitted via the blog. On the blog, there's a page where people can submit questions or requests for topics that we cover. And I have kind of a backlog of those, but I saw one that came in recently that I wanted to discuss. And I'm reaching out to you, Ben, because we have discussed this topic before, and I think you also have some personal experience with the topic as well. And I thought, who better to talk to about this than you? So thanks for being available. And Ben, maybe you could introduce yourself, talk about who you are, what you do, and where you live, as well as maybe some of our history together.
Yeah, sure. Briefly, I am Benjamin Morrison. I live in Svitlovodsk in Ukraine. Have lived here for 19 years now. You and I, Nick, obviously met over here in Eastern Europe. So while you were living in Hungary, and we met at a conference, I believe it was. So yeah, as far as kind of my ministry roles here, I'm pastoring Calvary Chapel Svitlovodsk, also the director for City to City Ukraine, and currently training coordinator for City to City Europe as well.
Okay, great. Well, we'll just dive right into the topic. The topic is one about bribery and corruption. And I'm going to just go ahead and read some of the question, and then we could get into some of the different angles and aspects of what the Bible has to say about corruption, and we'll hopefully answer this person's question directly. So here's what they said. They said, outside of Proverbs, bribery is spoken against, but inside of Proverbs, it seems to be both direct opposition to it, but sometimes almost approving of it. There are many verses against it, but here are some verses that could be taken as being for bribery. One of them is Proverbs 17, verse 8, which says that a bribe is like a magic stone in the eyes of the one who gives it. Wherever he turns, he prospers. Another is Proverbs 21, verse 14, that says, a gift in secret averts anger, and a concealed bribe, strong wrath. And since corruption and bribery are major topics in Ukraine, this is a thing that you guys deal with. And so I'm sure it's a relevant topic for many Christians. What's the right way to deal with bribery? If it's maybe you're going to get a service like at a hospital and you can't get the service that you need or that you should rightly get without getting a bribe. Maybe it's a government office. There are other ways in which bribery works. Maybe you could share that with us, Ben.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it really does have a lot of application for our situation here in Ukraine. Corruption, unfortunately, is very rampant here. If you look at international corruption indexes, Ukraine's usually near the bottom. Um, so yeah, the mail that you read obviously said that there's a lot of places where the Bible does seem to condemn bribery, and that's true. It talks about how, taking a bribe perverts justice, how it subverts the cause of the righteous, a lot of different places like that. If you look carefully at those places, the commands against bribes are specifically against taking bribes, because that's always an abuse of authority. It's using your position of power to get personal gain rather than to serve the people that you're supposed to serve, to give them the rights or services that you're required in theory to give them. And then there are a couple of verses which you referred to in Proverbs, where it doesn't seem negative, at least. It says that the person who gives a bribe, wherever he turns, he prospers, averts wrath. Here it's important to remember the nature of Proverbs. Proverbs is not a book of commands. It's not, the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments. It's not a book of promises necessarily. Really, it's life wisdom. It's describing, how the world works. So, in Proverbs, when it says person who, gives a bribe, kind of gets ahead, gets in, prospers, I mean, that's true, at least in a corrupt society. People get in places that way. It's not necessarily therefore saying that you should do that. So there's kind of two situations though when you might be tempted to or asked to give a bribe. The first one would be to pervert justice, just like for the person taking the bribe. And again, I'm emphasizing taking a bribe is always sin. It's always a perversion of justice. You're abusing your authority. Um, Giving a bribe, if let's say you've done something, you've broken the law, you should be penalized, but you give a bribe in order to not be penalized, well, you're also perverting justice. You're also subverting righteousness. It's also sin. But there's another situation where sometimes bribes are asked for or required. And that's where you should be given something from the person in authority. You know, maybe that's a policeman, maybe that's you know, a doctor, especially in a system, you know, where it's government medicine, that, you know, they have to approve you getting surgery, otherwise you don't get it. And basically they should do it, but because they want personal gain, they say, unless you give me a bribe, you won't get an operation, you know, or unless you get a bribe, you're going to be falsely accused and thrown in jail. Is it wrong to give a bribe in that case? And these cases, at least, you know, in Ukraine, are unfortunately not infrequent. I like to use an analogy to explain this. So if you think about somebody getting mugged, right? Somebody comes up to you, you know, pulls a knife to your throat or whatever and says, give me your wallet. Chances are you're going to give the person your wallet and walk away with your life, and that's okay. Now, if you think about what you did, you just gave a person money in order to allow you to have what you should have had anyway, which is your life, right? Are you guilty for giving them money? Of course not, right? You're a victim of injustice. You're a victim of a crime. Now, if you change the picture a little bit, again, take the doctor who says, you know, unless you give me your money, right, your life or your wallet, basically, you know, unless you give me something from your wallet, you're not going to get this operation and you're going to die. Or, you know, maybe not something that extreme, but, you know, you're going to get falsely accused, thrown in jail, or at least dragged through the courts a lot. In that case, are you sinning if you give it to them? It's really the same as with mugging. No, you're not. You know, you're the victim of injustice in that case. So, kind of to briefly answer the question, there's different scenarios. So we can't just kind of lump and say bribery always good or always bad. I mean, it's not good at any point, but is it a sin? Depends on which side you're engaging in. Depends on the reason for the engagement. Yeah. So
Okay. Well, let's circle around and talk about some of these issues, and then let's make sure that we answer this person's question directly. One of them, I want to just go back to what you're saying about Proverbs. I think that's a really good point. I realize this isn't exactly dealing with the issue of bribery per se, but I think it's a great point that you made about Proverbs. The Proverbs is not necessarily a book of promises. And I think that if you read it as a book of promises, you will give yourself maybe the wrong expectations. I think one of the greatest examples of this is in Proverbs 22, verse 6, right, where it says, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he's old, he will not depart from it. Well, many people take that as if that is a promise, like that is a guarantee that if you do the things right as a parent, then your child will go in the way that they should go. And they'll say, hey, look at this amazing promise. And it leads to one of two outcomes in some cases. In the case where your child does turn out great, if you take that as a promise, you pat yourself on the back and say, hey, look, I am an amazing parent. I did everything right. In the case where it does not go well, then it becomes this huge burden where you say, I have failed, I am, and I have to carry this burden. The reason my child, and let's say that they turn away from the Lord altogether, the fate of my child's soul rests purely on my errors. And that is a huge burden to carry and a terrible thing. But if we take this as a book of principles, the way that the world generally works,
right,
then yes, that's true. If you raise up a child in the way they should go, generally they go in that way. So that's just an important way for us to understand the book of Proverbs to begin with. Now let's talk about the other thing that I think would come up. In Hungary, we didn't have the same level of corruption as you have in Ukraine, but we did have some corruption. We had it with doctors, that they wouldn't come to deliver your baby, for example. That was a big
right.
one, unless you
Yep.
bribe them, or there was a sense in which it was expected that you bribe your doctors in order to get the surgery that you need and things like that. And We had it with police. I got shook down once on a tram, by the police, or by, it wasn't even a police. There's people they hire to be checkers of tickets.
Right.
But
We've got those people too.
yeah. So, but the thing in Hungary that they would always say, and I wonder if this is true ever in Ukraine, is that they didn't like the word bribe or,
Mhm.
corruption. They like to use the word tip, right? It's just that you're giving me a tip. And, like the police, or the doctor, you're giving them a tip, just like you would tip a waiter. What would you say? Do you ever get that line, or do you?
There's, yeah, not tipping. Tipping is not necessary. I mean, it's become more of a concept here, but they do talk sort of around it. I mean, nobody generally, it depends on the situation, but a lot of times people won't say directly, give me a bribe. But it's very clear that that's actually what has to happen. I mean, it happens a lot in universities here too. For,
Mm,
another example, for passing an exam, it's not like you can pay the bribe if you didn't study. It's like you're going to fail. You're going to get kicked out unless you pay the bribe. That's it.
mm-hmm. Wow.
Um, yeah. So
This is much more black and white, sounds like.
yeah, a little bit.
Yeah. Okay, so let's answer this question. I mean, is this saying that there's ever a time? I mean, how would you address these two verses? I mean, in Proverbs 17, verse 8, and Proverbs 21, verse 14, that, it almost seems to be approving of it, or is it? I mean, what is it saying here, and how do we apply this?
Yeah. And I mean, that's a good question. Again, it's describing, like you said, the way the world works, right? That's kind of what Proverbs is about. It's to give people wisdom. Um, you know, he prospers or, averts wrath, kind of negative consequences on the other hand. Um, there's actually an interesting example in the Bible of this situation where, kind of like the mugging, right? Where because of corruption of authorities, they're trying to extort a bribe from someone. And therefore, if that person were to have given a bribe, it wouldn't be sin. They would basically be being extorted. They'd be the victim. That's the case of the Apostle Paul when he was put in jail unjustly. Acts, talks about how the ruler realized that it was unjust, and yet he kept him in jail, hoping to receive a bribe from Paul. Now we know, obviously, from Acts that Paul didn't give a bribe. He chose not to. Why did he choose not to? At least in his case, he had a word from God that he, was actually to stay there. He was to be taken to Rome as part of this, sort of trumped up false legislative process, in order to witness in Rome. So just because we're saying that giving a bribe, if you're the victim of injustice, is not necessarily, it's not sin, does that mean you should always give it? Not necessarily. And how do you know, right? That's the real question. And I think the answer is mostly the same as for Paul, is you really need to hear from God. You really need to seek his wisdom. You need to seek the situation. I mean, in most cases, probably if it's a life or death question, you should probably just give it. Because you can't do anything else to change the system, at least in this world, if you're dead. But if it's something lesser, maybe you end up having to pay, like something that happens very frequently here is, you'll get, maybe something trumped up of a traffic charge from a cop who just made something up. And he really just wants, some money to let you go. And this is the case where you didn't actually break the rules, right? You didn't commit the traffic offense. If you did, you should just pay the actual fine. But will you want to give them the lesser amount of money so he let you go, or you say, no, I'm not going to give you a bribe, write me a ticket for the full amount? There's some suffering involved there, right? Same as for Paul, there's suffering. He had to stay in jail. The thing is, if we always give in, that's never going to challenge the system. It's never going to be an act, a prophetic act, in a sense of conviction of that system. So again, but on the other hand, do you have to always, not pay the bribe and maybe have a doctor basically threaten your life? Also, no. So again, it's really a question of, we need to seek the Lord, seek his guidance.
Mm,
We love easy answers, but very often in life, there aren't always the easy answers we want. And this would be one case like that, I think.
yeah. Yeah, well, let's talk about that for a second, about the idea of transforming the culture through prophetic acts. Maybe you could expound on that.
Yeah, I mean, in a nutshell, just to say that as the people of God, right, a royal priesthood, we're to be a signpost of the kingdom that is, initiated but not yet here in fullness, through the way that we live, through the things that we value, and that's to be in every area of life, right? It's not just a Sunday morning thing. So our education, our jobs, how we interact with authority and government systems and all that. So again, not to say that we have to always uh, choose the route of suffering and feel as if we are guilty or sinful if we, because again, we're the victim of injustice. In the case where somebody's extorting a bribe from us, basically for nothing, just to give us what they should have given us anyway. Um, on the other hand, we are called at the end of the day. I mean, I think ultimately what allows us to make that choice, and what allowed Paul to make that choice to say no, even though it wouldn't be sin necessarily, I'm not going to give the bribe. What allows us to do that is the gospel itself, right? Because the gospel says that Christ took our ultimate suffering that we did deserve by rights, and he was unjustly condemned, right? He was the one who didn't give a bribe to get out of it, even when it did cost him his life. And because we have that, freedom from ultimate suffering, not only are we redeemed from eternal suffering, but God also, through the gospel, redeems our temporary suffering, and empowers us to go through it, in some cases even willingly, right? Like in the case where you would say, no, I'm not going to give a bribe because I believe, in this instance at least, I want to be sort of a prophetic voice of the values of God's kingdom. And even if it costs me, twice as much, or even if, I get a really bad grade on the test or whatever it might be, I'm just not going to do it. But again, I think it's a case by case individual scenario. What I want to be careful to underscore is that we're not saying, well, if you don't stand up against it every time, well, then you're in sin. No, that's not the case. You're a victim of injustice.
Hmm. That's a good point. And I think that that is pretty unique about Christianity, that we are encouraged to share in the sufferings of Christ. We're encouraged to share. I love this phrase that I heard someone say recently. They said, and I've repeated it to our church many times over the past year, which is that in Christ, what it means to be more than a conqueror is that the worst things that can happen to you in Christ are also the best things that can happen to you. To suffer brings us, I mean, think about what James 1 says. Think about what Romans 5 says about the effects of suffering on us, that they are used by God in order to give us all of these things that we need. They even build hope, right? And then on the other hand, the worst amount of suffering we could ever suffer is death, which brings us literally to God. I mean, so that's what it means to be more than a conqueror, is that not only can we not lose, but in everything that happens, we win. And I think that that is a perspective which Christians have uniquely, that can set us free, as you're saying, to be willing to suffer in order to change a system, in order to change, and of course it's a drop in a bucket, but drops in buckets accumulate. So
Right. Yeah. And I mean, it's somebody might think, well, I'm never going to change the system on my own with my one act. I mean, we're not talking about, one individual and one act. We're talking about the people of God collectively, across the world, over the course of history. I mean, imagine if we actually had that, readiness through the gospel to willingly suffer in these ways. Could that change culture? Yeah, it could.
and I
And
think
and
that
even
it
if it doesn't,
has.
it's right. Yeah, yeah, it certainly has. And even when it doesn't, that witness of ours, right? That witness as the people of God, and witness to the power of the gospel by willingly suffering, is still a powerful thing.
Mm, yeah, and yeah, just going back to what I said, I think that it has. I mean, if you look at a value of human life, I mean, things like many things, even when it comes to gender, valuing of different genders and things like that, it's like this is something where we can see that Christians collectively acting together in certain ways over time has changed the way that not only Western society functions, but the entire world. I mean, it's incredible. So yeah, and I think that is part of what corruption does. It makes you feel powerless, makes you feel like I've got nothing, so I guess I just have to do this, and there's nothing I can do to change this.
Yeah.
But that's actually quite empowering, what you're
It
saying.
is, really is. Yeah.
So thank you, Ben. How can people find out more about you and your ministry?
Yeah, my pleasure to have this chat with you. Probably the best way would be to go to our church's website, which is really hard to spell for non-Russian speakers. It's cc Svitlovodsk, svitlovodsk.com. Another way, very soon, we're actually about to launch a new website for City to City Ukraine, which is much easier to spell, citycityukraine.com. That should go live somewhere in the middle of January at the latest. So,
Great. Thanks, Ben. God bless you.
yeah, thanks, Nick.